Okay. So I want to start off, and Judith, this will be a little bit hard for you, but I will send this reading out to you. I want to start off with showing you a reading that I want you to do. So let me share my screen. Oh, here it is. And so if you'll just kind of read through that and just take a couple minutes with that. And I'll try to describe it well enough so that you'll understand it, Judith, but you'll see it in a little bit. It's not
in the book?
It's not from the book. It's from another book. Can you see that well enough? I can make it go larger, but I have to scroll down if I do that. So in this reading, and I know some of you haven't gotten to the end, but I'll send it out to you as well so you can continue to read it. I just want to point out a number of different things. The author is very clear about the difference between race and racism. In fact, in the middle, the line that I highlighted, very important line, but race is the child of racism, not the father. We think about race as being undeniable and disputable. It's always been there. But I hope you saw in the passage ahead of time that much of that we've done about race is because we needed some way to describe how to force somebody else out. We had to figure out how to justify the middle passage. We had to figure out how to justify the trail of tears. We had to figure out how to feel better about ourselves. And that's where he gets into the process afterwards of naming the people. And by the people, that means those that are okay, that are right, that are above the others. But here's the part that I really want you to get to. Look at this paragraph right here that I'm going to highlight. The new people were something else before they were white. They were Catholic, Corsican, Welsh, Mennonite, Jewish, and if our national hopes have any fulfillment, then they will have to be something else again. Perhaps they will truly become American and create a nobler basis for their myths. I cannot call it. I love this thought of, are we so busy caught up in one part of our definition, this thing we call the white race, that we've lost all the other parts of who we are? And in doing that, we've taken white and placed it next to black or brown or yellow or whatever other color in order to diminish that other person, but maybe more importantly in our own hearts, lift ourselves up above that. Who are you? What's the strength of where you come from that somehow in the whitewashing of America has been lost. For example, my grandfather, Andre, when he was a child, was carried over here in the arms of his father, Claus. Their mother didn't come with them. His mother didn't come with them at that point, from the Netherlands. And so I am Dutch, 1/4 Dutch. And yet I bear very little of that because of how Grandpa was told not to be. And as a baby coming over, he didn't have much of that culture to hang on to. And he had to depend on his parents to give it to him, and they didn't because they were told not to. What was washed out of your growing up? So as you introduce yourself, I want you to think about some of who you wish you knew of your past, some of what you don't have because they became just white America. So let's start with Laura. Tell us about you. Tell us some of what you wish you knew more about of your past.
Well, I am fortunate that I do know a little bit because my mom is particularly interested in that, but it's not something I identify with. It's just facts. It's not something I can relate to. So I know that I have a lot of German in me. I also have some Dutch. And I wish that that was more a part of who I was. I wish that it influenced maybe more of the foods that I eat or the music I listen to, but it has no influence in my day-to-day life being of that background.
Right.
So I do regret that.
Thank you. Marty, how about you?
Well, we used to laughingly say we were Heinz 57 varieties. Uh, on my mother's side, her father was half German and half Irish. His mother and his father both came over in that time period of the 1800s from Germany and from Ireland. My mother, on that side of the family, we have French Huguenots who came to Nova Scotia and came down to the Carolinas and eventually migrated to Texas. On my dad's side, it goes all the way back to the Mayflower. And so on that side, I'm mostly British Isles. But I did my DNA with Ancestry. And there's also a little bit of Eastern Europe, a little bit of Hispaniola. There's just a little bit of smattering of everything. I don't identify with any of it. I guess mostly because my mother's family was so Irish. I did identify with that because that was her maiden name was Murphy. Yeah. And so we kind of, I think of myself as having that in my background, but I also know an awful lot about the ancestry of my father, which has been in America for a very, very long time. So I'm sort of American, and I really don't identify as any of those other things in any
right.
level.
The interesting thing about, like, for example, you talked about the Irish, the Murphy side of you. Part of the reason why that might have happened is because Irish is relatively newer, and so it isn't lost as much into the blending of.
Right.
Right?
Right. And then, but in my home, I have antiques that came with the great-great-great-grandmother who was a Huguenot and came over from France. So, it's, I really don't identify with any of it.
Okay.
Particularly.
All right.
I'm American.
Yeah. Leticia, tell us about you. You sound much better muted, but go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you. This is going to be difficult. What I lost is being able to identify as Latina.
Yeah.
My mother struggled so hard to be white that she never learned her heritage. We're learning some from ancestry, some from distant relatives, but it seems all of that side of the family struggled to be white so that they could achieve here. My father's side of the family is a little bit different. His father was Basque, and until my grandfather's generation, they didn't mix outside of the Basque people. He married my grandmother, who was Castilian Spanish, and she had some odd little rituals. We found out later that she came from a class of viceroys that became viceroys after the Inquisition. I'm Sephardic Jew as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Going to Minnesota, Nancy, tell us about yours. Don't forget to unmute yourself.
Sorry. I think it's interesting how different people have said how little influence whatever ancestry they have has on their daily life. Most of mine has been Scandinavian.
Well, I was thinking Southern Europe, not Northern. I'm just kidding. I know you're from Minnesota. Minnesota always has Northern Europe.
But I do think doing one's DNA is very interesting, that it is always expanding, and it's originally I would have said Danish, like almost the main, but it isn't. It's a lot of Scandinavian, a lot of Germanic, and it truly has, some influence in that my folks went back to Denmark and met with relatives, and most of our relatives have been back to visit, but not that it has a huge influence on our lives.
Continuing up through Minnesota, Randy and Carol, tell us about you guys.
Oh, I know nothing of my ancestry beyond my great-grandparents. Both sets of my great-grandparents on my father's side emigrated from Sweden in the 1890s, and on my mother's side, I only know that my great-grandfather, well, his father must have, well, he had been in the United States at least for a generation, from Germany. I know he was there that long because he actually fought in the Civil War. That's everything I know.
Carol, how about yourself?
I'm Nancy's sister, but I haven't had that ancestry.com done yet. And so I think all of the relatives are Danish because all the grandparents came over in the late 1800s. And I think we kept a lot of the traditions and stuff. I think our parents were real good at doing that. One of the things that I wish we would have done is learn the language. I mean, we can say like 3 words and that's it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I mourned, for example, in the 1990s, when the Berlin Wall fell and Eastern Europe opened up, is we had all these people who had come from there, but we had none of the people knowing the language currently to be able to step in and be present in those spaces, right? And when we wash that past out of ourselves, it's so easy for us to forget the power of what that past was. We lose all kinds of things. Judith, your turn.
Sounds a lot like Marty, my dad's family back to the 1600s. Oh, excuse me. Mother was proud of her Welsh background. She thought that's where the music came from in us. I've not done any of that ancestry stuff, and I also relate to the idea that it doesn't have any bearing on my life today. Just what one thought that crossed my mind this afternoon was it was more important in my family where Daddy's family came from than Mother. It was like the patriarchy.
Mm.
I had an aunt that gave me the family history so that I could become a daughter of the American Revolution. Because neither of her daughters wanted to. Well, I didn't want to either when I found out they didn't let black ladies in.
Mm.
So that's about all I know.
All right. Thank you. Siri, we're up to you.
So my history is Danish, or ancestry is Danish, Finnish, Scotch, British, Swiss. And then I knew about those. And when I did the Ancestry.com test, I was surprised to find out a little bit of Portuguese was in there, a little bit of Japanese. I wasn't as surprised there's a little tiny bit of African, because I think that my ancestors were in the United States long enough that I think there would have been some mixing of the races naturally. But the Portuguese was a surprise, and I haven't even talked to my family about it yet. And so that's interesting. And my dad, part of his ancestry is Finnish. And I was thinking as people were talking, there wasn't anything really that, was passed down that was cultural. But then I realized that I believe pasties is Finnish. It's like a
Like pasties.
What's that?
I like those.
Yeah. And usually people don't know what I'm talking about. But anyhow, my family would make pasties at for special occasions. And it took quite a while to do. My parents would roll out the dough and everything and, bake them. And it just, anyway, that's the only thing I can think of that's really part of our ancestry that was passed down. But we do still have a relative left in Denmark, and the rest of the family has visited Denmark.
So I'm going to give you a supposition about why it is that we have lost all of that. Because somebody looked at your ancestor and said, you better lose that about you. Somebody looked at their language, their custom, their way of dressing, their way of being, and they said, that will not help you as you try to integrate here into America.
That's what I was talking about, not learning my mother's side of the family, because it still is a complete denial of her heritage.
Yeah.
Because she was told, you got to be whiter than white.
Yeah.
Mm.
The good news about all of us is that we were able to essentially integrate in, get past the prejudice that was placed in front of us. Our skin color, the tones of our skin didn't immediately disqualify us. Some people don't have that luxury. And in America specifically, as we have done that, not just to each other, but to them specifically, it was very simple for us to continue to have them on the lower side of the scale because they couldn't step away from some of those things. Like, I don't have to admit that I'm Dutch. It doesn't show as a mark on my skin. Not everyone has that luxury, shall I say? Especially when we have used that very strongly to be in anti-relationships to them, against them, diminishing them, hiding them in one way or another. that's a lot of what we're going to try to talk about here, is we're going to try to figure out how to not name our people only by one or two different things. That if you're light skinned, you're better. If you have blonde hair, if you do this type of thing. We want to name the people as largely and broadly as possible. Okay? Both the people that gave us birth, but also the people around us. And to be in a space of honoring and encouraging all of that which can give, which we say we like when we talk about diversity, right? When we talk about united we stand, originally that meant we stand in all of the differences, and it became too much of we stand the same. And it's not what it's supposed to be. The power of America were the differences. And I think we have to try to start bringing that back. But to do that, we have to somehow figure out how to undo racism. And it has to be consistent, and it has to be ongoing. We have to be consistently aware of when it is that we step into a space of less than perfect reactions to our neighbors. How many have found yourself somewhere in life being racist? Not because you were necessarily meaning to, but because there you were in a space where that benefited you, or it was just what was normal for you. And part of what we have to do is we have to start being aware and trying to figure out how to not allow that to be the norm, especially when we can clearly see that it's at somebody else's expense. I told you one of my big awakenings about when I was a junior in high school, and they were going to cut out the summer track program. Right? Did everyone hear that story? Okay, well, let me tell you real quickly again. Running was my life when I was in high school, and they were going to cut out my program that I needed during the summer. And so we got everyone to sign up, all the kids at schools to sign a petition, say we want summer track. And so we went to the city council. And at the city council in Beeville, Texas, which is more than 50% Hispanic and only about 40% Anglo, I looked up at the front where the city council people were sitting, and there were only 3 men sitting there, 3 white men. Now there were 2 Hispanics on the board, but on the council, but they were sitting in the front row because they knew that their demographic was underrepresented. There should have been, districting wise, allowed there to be more white elected officials than others. And so their demographic was underrepresented. And I'd never thought about that. Why? Because I benefited from it. As an Anglo, I got 3 voices on the board instead of just the 2 that my Hispanic friends got. But it began to, because many of my friends, my running friends, I ran long distance, and most of my fellow teammates in long distance were Hispanics. And I said, why is it good for me to be happy about that at their expense? That's what we have to be aware of, is wherever it is that somehow there's something there that I haven't seen, and begin to be aware of it. It helps us to just whitewash it away. But at the end of this article, it said this: the process of washing the disparate tribes white, the elevation of the belief in being white, was not achieved through wine tastings and ice cream socials, but rather through the pillaging of life, labor, and land, through the flaying of backs, the chaining of limbs, the stranglings of dissidents, the destruction of families, the rape of mothers, the sale of children, and various other acts meant, first and foremost, to deny you and me the right to secure and govern our own bodies. And by that, this book was written as a father speaking to a son, a Black father speaking to his Black son, and saying, we have to figure out how to step into a better thing. This was written by Ta-Nehisi Coates. It's a marvelous book called Between the World and Me. And so if you get a chance, you should read that. But it sets the stage for what we have to do today. And his bottom line is, Ibram Kendi's bottom line is, the difference between racism and anti-racism. It's become vogue to be able to say, I'm not racist. And his whole point is, I don't care. That's not good enough. Because if you are just not racist, then in truth, you really are still perpetuating racism. You have to be an active participant in dismantling systems, dismantling things within your own head, as well as in the system around you, to make it so that that racism is diminishing in its power in this country. How many know that right here in Tucson, there's a few things that are racist about how we have things set up? Let me give you one example. My wife works for the Catalina Foothills School District, and consistently it is rated as one of the highest school districts in the whole state of Arizona. She is proud and happy to be part of that school district, but it's completely different than what she's taught before, which in Yuma was a school which was 90% Hispanic, 95 to 100% on free and reduced lunch. That does not describe Catalina Foothills School District. On the south side of town is a district called Sunnyside School District. It struggles consistently, mostly because of its racial makeup. And because the people who are the parents of the children who go through that school district tend to be working class people. And so we've set up a thing, for example, where Catalina Foothills District gets a whole lot of extra money into their school district. You know what it's called? Tax credits. You can give $200 or $400 as a couple to be able to help your school, and get specific things done in your district. And so the rich people in the Catalina Foothills read white parents give a lot of extra money that people in Sunnyside can't give, thus lengthening the distance between the haves and the have-nots. Policies like that have consistently been done in education, in business, in other ways to make it easier for the white to succeed at the expense of other demographics. For the rich to succeed at the expense of the poor end of our spectrums. Where have you seen that around you? Go ahead.
My oldest is 40. I put all my kids through parochial education. When I started them in the mid-'80s, the Catholic schools were almost gone. They weren't supported. The classrooms were about half full. And those of us that were sending the kids were not just paying for their education, we were volunteering dozens of hours every month in order to maintain the school. Once, and this was before Catalina Foothills was developed, once parents, you had Greenfields and another couple academies for primary education, but not a whole lot of private schools outside of parochial. Once it caught on that their kids could get better education through a parochial education, those schools were overrun by the more affluent. They started donating more, and because they were donating more, they were demanding more voice. So very quickly, the parishioners couldn't send their kids to school anymore because the schools were getting stuff done and the tuition went up and it no longer was parochial.
Mhm. And that type of education prices out those of poorer neighborhoods, which typically in America means neighborhoods of color.
Yeah, and that's what they were designed for originally.
That's right. That's exactly right. How about the rest of you? Where are there policies or actions around you where you see it easier for one person, a white person, for example, rather than, or you could even say it on the gender scale, where is it easier for a male than for a female in our country?
One area I'm really aware of is in business. I think it's about 5% of venture capital goes into women or minority, or I think it's women-owned businesses actually. The other 95% goes into mostly white male businesses, business ventures.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. Very well documented how we are not very supportive of women moving forward in business areas, or minorities for that matter. Nancy.
One interesting study that they've done is how much hotter areas that have been redlined for minorities are than the rest of the city because of lack of green space and the way the buildings are. And I think, and even how long people live, longevity is impacted by that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to talk about this more in the class this afternoon, this evening, called The Hate You Give, the movie that we're looking at. That movie highlights very strongly how neighborhoods of color are underserviced. And the neighborhoods that are taken care of, and I don't mean by the residents, but by the city, tend to have little police action in them. Laura, did I see your hand?
Yeah, I was just going to say, out here in North Carolina, there's been a lot of discussion over the last few years about voting rights and access to voting.
Mm-hmm.
And it's clear that the way some of the laws have been designed out here, it tends to create more barriers for people of color to vote, without a doubt. In fact, it's so blatant that not even really disputed that that's what it's for. It's terrible. So they're trying to object to these laws and make changes so that people of color in particular have more access to voting.
Good. Randy.
I was a lawyer before I retired. I would say our entire legal system is an engine to perpetuate inequality in our society. Our entire social life is built on the private ownership of real property, the accumulation of wealth, and the cross-generational transfer of that wealth based on familial connections. And over time, that develops an inertia that is impossible to overcome absent truly revolutionary change.
Absolutely.
I mean, you see the dilemma of even profoundly wealthy people like Lori Loughlin and her husband, who, you know, are facing going to prison because they, as rigged as the system was, they wanted to rig it a little further to guarantee their children access to elite universities. And it's those kind of institutions, those kind of dynamics that create and perpetuate inequality.
Right. And the thing of it is almost always it is an advantage to me, but it's always at somebody else's disadvantage. And to become anti-racist, you have to say, I have to care enough about their disadvantage as what I care about my advantage. And that's a challenge for us to do, because we easily see what we want to better, what benefits us. But can we care about the larger us enough to care about that larger story? Leticia.
That particular subject is a double-edged sword, especially when you're speaking to minorities.
Mm-hmm.
Gentrification, urban renewal really affected the livelihoods and the opportunities for minorities, specifically for Latinos here in Arizona, in Tucson specifically. It was a way to take away their opportunity to build an entrepreneurial lifestyle, to build a little bit of wealth, and to secure. And it's really interesting to talk to people that have just come here from South America or Central America or Mexico. And I lived with a guy that liked to find his Latino to come and move stuff for him. And it used to just piss me off. But I remember Francisco walking into our home that we bought in Utah. And he walked in the entryway and he goes, oh my God, what they say, you live in a palace. These two rooms over here, my living room and my dining room, you know, they were small by our comparison, right? He goes, we'd have 4 families in there and we'd be happy. So yeah, I see the limitations, but I can also see that we're doing immigrants here at the service if we say no more private ownership, right? Because it's a control thing. How much is too much, right? Because you got people coming in with nothing. They just want this one.
Yeah. And that is a difficulty. When I was down in Yuma, I was working a lot with homeless people. And in Yuma, I don't know if you've been there much, but it has one of the highest percentages of mobile homes anywhere in the nation, like one of the top 3 cities in the whole nation. And a lot of them are old places, right? And so I was working with building inspectors, and they said, well, there's got to be up to a certain code. I said, but you know what? If you're trying to get off the street, sometimes having a space where you can afford means that it's not quite up to the normal code. But what we want to do is just get people into a house and say, okay, now they're fixed. And what it's talking about is it's got to be an ongoing relationship so that they don't stay in that subpar housing. We continue to be with them and help them move forward. So too often our things in racial relations are the same. We want a simple, easy fix. Instead of continuing to work, continue to move forward in this. Continuing to be challenged by one more thing that we have, that where there's benefits for some, but not across the board. So a lot of anti-racist, at the end of the introduction, and kind of I'm just going to start today is just going to just be kind of an introduction. If next week you will read that introduction in chapter 1 and chapter 2, then that will be the focus of our discussion. But at the end of the introduction, he says this: we know how to be racist. We know how to pretend to be not racist. Now let's know how to be anti-racist. That's what we're trying to figure out, is how to, in every single moment, work towards changing that which we've become aware of is standing in the way of the best of what we should be. And the hard part is it's going to be sometimes, oftentimes, something that you benefit from, but that somebody else doesn't. And so we're going to have to be very honest with ourselves about our advantages that we want, but that somebody else doesn't get. So for example, if I want sidewalks in my community, guess what I need to expect in that community, that Hispanic community on the South Side?
Can I turn that around?
Uh-huh.
If you want sidewalks in your neighborhood and you want to see the South Side have sidewalks too, get involved and help them get the federal grant money that the county has denied them for 40 years.
That's right. And it's that type of action that we have to become aware of, and not just be happy that, okay, I've got it, but figure out where it is that it's not a universal gift right now or expectation. And the hard part is that might mean that we end up working contrary to where somebody in our neighborhood wants it to be different. I don't know if any of you live in gated communities. I hope I'm not going to insult anybody here, but gated communities are often a way for us to hide away and live with our advantages, so we don't have to see somebody else's disadvantage. And that becomes especially clear when you have a strong homeowners association that sometimes says, I'm going to control everything around me. I'm going to make everybody be my idea of what it should be like, which oftentimes excludes people who can't afford to be that and leaves them on the outside of that. And so they leave those neighborhoods. Many of those types of policies developed in a way to be able to preserve white America over colored America. And do we continue to perpetuate those types of policies, or do we work for a different type of governance of ourselves and of our communities that will change that? The first step is to be aware and to choose not to be offended when it's something that I hold on to. Laura.
So first I have a confession to make. I've already read the book, but I'm looking forward to rereading it with all of you. And I have to say, one of the things that I struggled with so much, and you're just now talking about it, Jim, is that I think because I'm a white person, and I realize that now, I've never really had to think about policies.
No.
I'm a white person and I'm not political. So I never thought about policies. I kept reading this book going, well, I never thought about that. Well, I never thought about that. And then towards the end of the book, I realized that was one of my privileges, that I never had to think about policies because they already benefited me so much. And so when he kept talking about how to be an anti-racist, you have to get in and change policy. I don't disagree with him, but since I've never thought about policy, I'm not quite sure how to change policy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But see, that's part of the uncomfort that you have to take on, is you have to step into new roles that you haven't had to be, right? Black America has had to walk the streets in protest. White America can choose to do that, right? Whole different space. What are you going to do? Is going to be our ongoing, consistent question to each other. How are you going to be challenged in this moment to do something more? Leticia, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, just to what Laura was saying, has anybody here been in Tucson since the 1950s.
Mm-mm.
So nobody knows what the Barrio Viejo really looked like,
Mm-mm.
right? You know where St. Augustine Cathedral is, and the Barrio Viejo, and then Tucson Community Center, the theater, the hotels, and everything else. That was a 3-plaza barrio, and it maintained about 1,500 families. The year I was born, they tore it down because the white people wanted to be closer to the river. It was the established pueblo when the Gadsden Purchase went through. They displaced in 6 months 1,500 families and said, here's some money, find another place. And these were generational homes. It's that kind of thing, and we're still seeing it with gentrification. My mother lives just south of South Point, and that was always a kind of a first home buyer family size community. It's being gentrified too. So it's not just it's becoming a mix. A lot of it is seated in racism, but it's also socioeconomics too. So we're cutting out a whole opportunity for a whole bunch of people. Even Dunbar neighborhood downtown, which was the black neighborhood, that's where they put the black soldiers, has now been gentrified. And there's very few original families in there. Again, after generations of ownership in that area. So it's not always the wealthy that are trying to establish a generational legacy. They're just trying to do a generational security.
So let's talk. Oh, go ahead. I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead. I just want to make sure as we're brainstorming, we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Yeah. One of the things that's going to stand in our way is some of the ways that we have been taught to be in these areas. So in this introduction, he talks about the word racist. And he asks the question, how many of us would agree with this statement? Racist isn't a descriptive word, it's a pejorative word. And it shouldn't be. Most of us have become taught well enough that you don't want to be called racist because that's pejorative. It's a descriptive thing. It doesn't mean you're good or bad. It means that you are in a space where things are benefiting you at somebody else's expense, and we need to change those things. In all of these things, my take is always this: if you want it, then you should have it. You should, if you want it so much that you need it around you, you should work hard for everyone else to be able to have that as well. If that's a universal need for you, it's a universal need for them. Does that make sense? But if you're wanting it for you at their expense, it has inherent inequalities built in there. And that's racist, not because you're bad, but because you're supporting something that is hurting someone else. Or maybe an inaction, not fighting against that, which is hurting another person.
I was impressed with this paragraph about color blindness, that is synonym to not racist, and that the Justice John Harlan said that the Constitution is colorblind, while for a white supremacist America,
That's
when
exactly
he was
right.
saying legalizing Jim Crow segregation.
That's exactly right. And that's what we have to work against, is we have to start being very aware of all of those types of things. Things that, like Laura said, she hasn't had to be aware of before, that we haven't had to be aware of, because it's easy for us to not have to. If we're going to be anti-racist, we have to choose to hear and see what right now has been easier for us not to. So I'm going to give you a couple things to be able to help you. Let me share my screen and I'll show you. some some things for you. The United Methodist Church Religion and Race Committee is doing something right now called the 30 Days of Anti-Racism. And before I get to that, I want you to look right here. If you get to this page, and I will give you a link to this page on the handout I'm going to send to you. If you go to this little space right here, can you see where it says anti-racism right there? If you click on it, you'll get to this page, which gives you several different things you can do. There's a class they're going to give on overt and covert racism. Another online course on You Are Here, First Steps for White Christians on Race and Racism. So those are a couple of good things, but I want to go back to the page where I was at, where it's this 30 Days of Racism, and there's a calendar right here. And all through September, they're saying, begin to do some of these things. So 2 days ago, you were supposed to pray about how God is calling you to act. Then yesterday, our task was draft your racial autobiography. Kind of what we already started doing. And then number 3, today's thing is participate in intercultural conversation. Well, look, you're kind of doing that, although we don't have much intercultural.
No.
All right. And so each one of these will show you some of the ways that you can step into this anti-racist space. And it'll take a lot of work and a lot of intentionality, but that's a good resource for you to begin to do that. Let me show you another resource. Ibram Kendi, who is our author, has a TED talk that he's done. It's called The Difference Between Being Not Racist and Anti-Racist. The link will be on the materials that I send out to you. So watch for that. I'll send it out as soon as this class is over, if you'll do something for me. In the chat box, if you'll put your email address, especially if you don't think I have it, if you'll put your email address in there, that will help me to remember to get you on the list. Okay, and I'll send all that information to you. Okay. Having said all that, then I want you to know that at least part of what Ibram Kendi is trying to do here is he's trying to help us to see he's moving, he's changing, and how do we change as well. He's not asking us to go by ourselves. Look at one of the things that I loved best about where he was at was this. Oops. On page 10 of the introduction, he said, I used to be racist most of the time. I am changing. And then he begins to list some of the ways that he's trying to change. I am no longer identifying with racists claiming to be not racist. That claiming to be not racist is not good enough for him any longer in other people. I'm no longer speaking through the mask of racial neutrality. He is the race that he is, and he is going to speak from that position. I'm no longer manipulated by racist ideas to see racial groups as problems. So how many have seen, for example, in the midst of the last couple of months, people all of a sudden saying, well, this is what Black people do, and identifying them as a group instead of as a series of individuals. All of these things are ways that he is learning and growing. And he's asking us to say, how are you going to? Leticia, I'm sorry, I stepped on you.
I'm sorry. I said, or Latinas, or women, or gay people, or transgenders.
That's exactly right.
Everything.
All those different ways that we separate ourselves, usually because we have advantages that make it easy for me to survive that separation. But at whose expense? This point down here is especially important. I've come to see that the movement from racist to anti-racist is always ongoing. I hope you've made a lot of progress this way in your life, in all these areas. It can be very simple because of that to say, done, don't have to work any longer. But this moment is proving to us that we do have to continue to work, don't we? This moment is showing up difficulties of what we haven't solved yet. And it is asking us, are we going to care enough about things to change once again? So as we leave, we have about 4 minutes left. So I want you to take about 30 seconds each and tell me one thing you think you're going to, that you're feeling right now that this is one of the ways that you're being challenged to change. What's something in your life or in the world around you that you're saying, this is one of the things I'm doing? It can be a small thing, because there's lots of things.
I'm no longer afraid to be called a humanist, and I will not allow anybody to call me a secular humanist anymore.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I'm no longer ashamed to say that I am a white person. I think he makes that very plain that we are to identify with who we are. I am
Exactly.
female in America.
That's exactly right. Thank you.
I'm no longer, when I'm going to describe somebody that I just met, I notice that if they're white, I just describe them. If they're black or Asian, sometimes I say, I met this lovely black woman or this lovely Asian. I'm not going to do that anymore because that's not going to be relevant anymore.
Anyone else?
I'm willing to look at anything that involves change, but I'm pretty dense, and I need examples. I need things pointed out to me as to how I might be being racist, because I don't know. I really don't know. I try to treat everybody the same, and I don't know that there's anything that I can do at this stage of my life to help anybody get a job or better treatment in education or something like that. So other than vote, I'm open to ideas.
Good. I thought, and hopefully through all of this, we will surface a lot of ideas, both in here in our community, but also in the rest of the world. There's a lot of places where corporately we can make a difference. And the thing that's going to stand in our way most of all, Joyce, is our reluctance to move that direction when it calls out to us. Think how many people post Minneapolis saw the awful racist moment and in that time said, oh, we got to change, but then went right back very quickly within a couple of weeks, couple months to defending themselves and what was easier for them.
Mm-hmm.
We have to continue to listen and hear and do the hard work of moving in the ways that this will move us. 400 years, we've had racism very strongly in America. It is built into our DNA in too many ways. And we have to start excising it from that DNA. And it will take a lot of very intentional, deliberate, and difficult work to reverse those 400 years of what we've taught each other. Leticia.
Is there an area, I mean, Leticia was talking about where they bulldozed a barrio to build up civic areas. Are there areas in Tucson that are pretty segregated? I'm just not aware of, I mean, I know that there are certain areas like down around South Tucson
South Tucson is very Hispanic.
are like primarily Hispanic families, but I'm not aware of any particular area that is Black oriented. Where I live, my subdivision is very integrated. So
The
I don't
Black
know.
communities have migrated north. Most of them are around the Fort Lowell and First Avenue area. Dunbar, which is a historic area just north of downtown, was historically the Black community. But it's been gentrified. People are going in, buying up the houses, and they're moving out. And Barrio Hollywood is and Menlo Park. Well, Menlo Park's being gentrified. Barrio Hollywood is really the last full barrio that we have because it's a little more updated houses. The houses in Barrio Hollywood were built in like the 60s. And remember, Joyce, Pima County only has 3.3% Black people. So the communities are going to be a lot smaller than the Hispanic, and a lot of the Hispanics ended up moving south into the Midvale area, but they're being displaced out of there too.
But is gentrification all bad? You know, it used to be that as a realtor, you know, 20 some years ago, for a lot of years, 20 some years that I sold real estate, people basically chose where they wanted to live, and it was illegal to point people in one direction or another because of their racial identity. And I firmly believed in that. I didn't know anybody in an office of probably 30 to 40 salespeople that would dream of doing that. So, but that was, you know, that was like 40, 50 years ago.
Yeah.
So the gentrification, as I see it, how I was going to say this, I guess, is that there were a lot of it was very seldom that there were people from the primarily Black areas of the city of Milwaukee or the primarily Hispanic areas of the city of Milwaukee, separated by a river and an expressway, that wanted to leave their home base area, the area they had always known. In the lily white suburbs, the people that came in were from out of state or out of the city. They weren't from in the city. So, and it wasn't because people wouldn't have been welcome. It was just that that's where they were comfortable. So when I look at gentrification, and you've got wealthier people that can afford to fix up homes, white people going into areas that have been Black areas or Hispanic areas because they like the architecture and they can afford to do that work that is necessary. Somehow or another, that to me is a good thing. And yes, it's changing property values. And so poor people can't necessarily afford to live there anymore. But it's doing racial integration in reverse. No?
Here's the good news. We don't have to solve it today.
Okay.
There's lots of ways. I mean, it is time for us to end. But
Joyce, grab my email. Send me an email.
all of those kinds of questions are exactly what we have to ask, and we have to struggle with, and we have to decide. So it is nice to have a community center like, like the downtown convention center. It's nice to have that. But what happened in order for us to have that the destruction of that neighborhood? And that's what you have to ask, Joyce. Not just are there positives coming out of it, but always at what expense? What did somebody lose because of that? And
But property
it's harder
value,
to figure this out, but what was deliberate
We'll
about
send you a
that?
note.
Does that
okay,
make sense?
I'm gonna send you an email, Leticia.
All right, my friends.
I did an art history paper that was pretty good on this in the summertime. So we'll talk.
All right. Thank you so much for your time. We will see you next week. Read chapters 1 and 2 as well as the introduction. Thank you.